Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Lisa Sawsville. I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Coverts Woodlands for Wildlife. We're a statewide nonprofit that works to educate landowners and others about sound forest management and wildlife stewardship. And today we're going to be talking about jumping worms. And we have Juanita Birch Clay with us. She's a retired educator, finishing up her career by running a farm and forest program for at-risk youth. She's currently a part-time ski instructor, town auditor, and a UVM Extension Master Gardener. Juanita went through the Vermont Coverts Cooperator Training, which you can learn more about by visiting our website, in 2016. She has run sessions teaching our cooperators how to use iNaturalist and just get engaged in their woods. And she's worked with invasive plants. You know, as Master Gardener, you talk about these invasive plants. She gained a strong interest in learning about invasive worms, and that's because she discovered them in her own garden that was brought in with a load of composted cow manure. So I'm going to turn it over to Juanita to share with us what she's learned about jumping worms. And yeah, it should be a good time. So Juanita, take it away.
Okie doke. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm sorry you're here because you need to learn about jumping worms, but it's a topic that is close to my heart as I fight them off in the garden, and I'm happy to share what I've learned about them. I'm not a scientist or a professor or a professional, but I have been paying attention to them. I've attended a number of conference meetings and webinars and done the reading research that we need to do. So I can give you an overview, and at the end of the presentation, we have there's a list of references and resources, and I can also send out a document that has more resources. So there's a lot of information out there. If you want to dig deeper into the science of it, the phenology of it, there's plenty of information out there. So I'm going to share my screen with you now, and I'll talk through a series of slides. And if you have questions as we go along, please type them in the chat. And Lisa, you can interrupt me if there's something appropriate, or else we'll do questions at the end. Okay, give me a minute. Let's see if I can make this screen share work. Right there and there. All right, is everyone seeing crazy jumping Asian snake worms?
Yes, we are.
Okay, so now, most of the bulk of my information comes from Dr. Joseph Gores and Mariam Nouri Ain, who are at UVM. Dr. Gores and his team have done a lot of research with the worms, and they're right up to date on it. So that's something to be proud of in Vermont. Okay, well, one of the big questions that comes up first is, are earthworms native? There are a few native earthworms in North America, but around here, there are none. They were mostly eliminated by the Ice Age. The European worms, the ones we think of as normal worms, first came over with settlers. And in some ways, we can think of them as naturalized. They've kind of made their place here. But even our normal European worms are bad for our forests because they eat a lot of the organic matter that seedlings and native plants need. But we've sort of settled into some balance with them. The Asian worms, which are native to Japan and Korea, they've been in the country from the 1860s on. They probably came into California from China with imports at that time. Some people suspect they came to Washington, D.C. in 1912 when the Japanese gave us the cherry trees. I'm not sure if that's true. One of the most interesting ones is they were brought to the Bronx Zoo in 1948 to feed. They were hoping they would feed the Australian platypuses. Unfortunately, the platypuses did not like them, and they escaped. Not the platypuses, the worms. So over time, these worms spread a little bit actually in the New York area. And you can see there on the screen, By 1980, they were beginning to be found in parks around New York. 2012, a study found them in 13% of natural areas, but they think they might be in as many as a quarter or a third. And then the number rose drastically, and they think that's because of Hurricane Sandy. The theory is that with all the trees that came down in New York that were chipped and spread around as mulch, a lot of the worm eggs or cocoons may have been spread that way. And in Vermont, they've been in Vermont, but it's really the last decade or so that we've seen them spreading. So it's the last 10 or 15, maybe 20 years that suddenly they seem to be blossoming in a bad way. So are earthworms good or bad? So the European worms may be good in an annual ecosystem, something that's, like your garden. They do some aerating, they do some fertilizing. Darwin, interesting, Darwin did a study of earthworms, and I'll go into that later, that changed people's minds about it. The problem is Darwin studied earthworms that were good in Europe. They're not necessarily good in North America. In a perennial ecosystem like a forest, something that's not regenerating every year, even the European worms are not good because they eat up some of the organic matter too fast. And there are some forests, for example, in Wisconsin and Minnesota, that have suffered with just the normal European worms. But we're thinking about the Asian worms. So in our forests, the Asian worms can be highly destructive because they eat the organic layers at the top of the forest floor. All those leaves that the forest ecosystem needs to decay slowly, these Asian worms go through them really, really fast. And so they take away some of the environment that seedlings need, that some of the microorganisms need. And in the end, we get seedlings, native plants that can't regenerate. We get roots that are effective. So they can be pretty bad for forests. In the garden, they go through the organic matter so fast that they disturb the soil structure. They make it kind of crumbly. And although their castings, their poops, are putting out lots of nutrients, it's in a fashion that the plants can't access them. So we'll come back to that in a moment. Let's go back to Darwin, because this is so interesting to me. Darwin studied earthworms in his home for 40 years, and he published his findings in 1881, and it was a bestseller, more than The Origin of the Species. And before Darwin, people thought of worms as a pest. And it's after he did this research, and he concluded that they were providing nutrients for the garden, that they were nature's tiller. Suddenly all the avid gardeners in England went, oh, we like these worms. And then that idea came over to us. So we've always been taught that earthworms are great. We love seeing them in the garden. But in actuality, the earthworms we have here are not native, and they're not necessarily good for us. And the Asian worms are actively bad for us. So what do these worms do? The jumping worms consume the upper layer in the forest, the layer called duff. The nutrients wash away quickly because it changes the soil structure, and the trees and plants can't absorb these nutrients fast enough. And so some of those nutrients get washed away by rain. It's there's more likely to be erosion. Roots get messed up. So I'm going to show you a little video which gives you a visual of this. It might take me a moment to get it, but I'm going to unshare and then share. Okay, I'm stopping the share. I'm going to find that video. right. Are you seeing the video?
Yes, everything looks great. Thanks, Juanita.
There's one simple hearing hack anyone can
I'm afraid
use
we
to
have to go
improve
through
their
the ad
hearing
for a
almost
moment.
overnight.
Okay, hang on. I'm going to put it back to the beginning. Okay. Worms can be beneficial, but the worms eat up all the leaf litter. They rapidly consume matter on the forest floor. The organic layer is important for the growth of the plants. The tunneling can pull the plant nutrients down and out of the plant's reach. Sometimes the plants get suffer drought conditions because of this. Changes the chemistry structure. The nutrient release problem. So normally the leaf litter slowly decomposes. But earthworms break down the leaf litter so quickly that lots of the nutrients are lost, and it's too fast for the plants to pick it up again. So jumping worms, it's like fast release fertilizer, and the plants can't uptake it fast enough before it gets washed away. This can deplete the forest of nutrients, leaving it barren. So why the big fuss about jumping worms more than others? They mature twice as fast as our European invasives. They reproduce more quickly. They are more aggressive. They can exist at higher densities. You often find where you find one jumping worm, you usually find more. And that means they can more quickly deplete the forest leaf litter layer, which means more severe and rapid impacts on our forest. We currently don't have any viable control methods for jumping worms, but you can still help prevent their spread. Don't move soil, mulch, or compost that has worms. Always check for worms. Clean vehicles and personal gear. There we have it. Okay, I'm going to stop that and I'm going to go back to this share. So that I think is a nicely graphic presentation of how the worms work. And just as again, going back to one of those photos, here's an example of a forest with no earthworms on your left, and on your right, where they have the jumping worms. You don't get the seedlings. This is actually can be quite a problem for maple forests in particular. So it has an economic impact as well. If your seedlings aren't growing, that's trouble down the line. So Asian worms. They are found in Vermont. There are many species, but there are 3 that we are concerned about. They can be 1 to 8 inches in length. One of the ways you can tell them, especially this time of year, is they have the ring or clitellum that goes all the way around the worm. On European earthworms, it's more like a saddle. It doesn't go all the way around, and it's a little farther away from the head. Usually a pale, pinky, milky color. Here are examples of some of them. This one is, whiter, a couple of darker ones. One way to tell if they're adults, now I'm saying if they're adults, it's the clitellum. If they don't have a clitellum, you can't identify it. So the younger ones are harder to identify. If the clitellum goes all the way around, yes, it's one of the jumping worms. If it doesn't go all the way around, it's a European worm. So with this slide, you can find, try and figure out which kind of jumping worm it is. The Amenthis tokyoensis, the Amenthis agrestis, the Metaphyra hilgendorfi. For our purposes, or for my purposes, I don't pay attention to which kind it is. I'm just concerned about managing them. Other ways that you can identify them: smooth, glossy, dark gray, usually. The clitellum going all the way around, as we just said. Bodies are firm, not slimy. One of the reasons they're called jumping worms is that they can thrash violently. That's a little bit misleading in some cases, because they also know how to just lay still and hope that you'll go away. So they don't always jump, but when you poke them, they do thrash violently. And I'll show you a video in a little bit. They tend to occur in large numbers. You usually find one. When you find one, there's going to be more. And you can see, you know they're there when you see the castings. The soil, surface of the soil looks grainy. And people compare it to the look of coarsely ground coffee. They compare it to ground beef. And I'm not sure how clear this is, but if you look here on the left side, this is where the jumping worms have been. And over on the right side, the soil texture is unchanged. And this is actually, you can actually see, almost see a line there. And this is not photoshopped in any way. This is just a picture out of a little piece of my garden. So how to find them? You know, we look for worms, they're near the surface of soil and mulch. The European worms tend to go deeper. The jumping worms stay near the surface. They particularly like to be under a layer of decaying leaves, for example. You look for those coffee grounds, again, that granular coffee ground look. The soil structure is clearly changed. One way to try and bring them to the surface is making a mixture of mustard seed powder and water. And if you drench the soil with that, theoretically, the worms come wiggling to the top. It's a little fussier than it sounds. I haven't had a lot of luck using that, but I don't have any trouble finding them either. I look more for the castings when I'm looking for them. The life cycle is a part of the way that we're going to control them. So they have the eggs or cocoons, which are the size of poppy or mustard seeds. And those are the problem because they can survive the winter and you can't really see them. The worms hatch in the spring, when the temperature gets to a certain, I think it's 50 degrees or more, and a certain amount of moisture. Little teeny worms, you can barely see them. And then in the summer or fall, they grow to their adult stage. You can see, again, the clitellum there, and produce new cocoons. And unfortunately, they don't need to have sex to reproduce. So they can lay their eggs, their cocoons, individually. So really, every worm that you can dispose of before it gets to maturity is a worm that's not reproducing. And that's one of the reasons when I go into the garden, I always take a little bucket of soapy water, and every worm I see goes into that soapy water because I don't want them reproducing. So here again is the life cycle. So, and this is for our area, Vermont, New York, Vermont, New England. So the worms are juveniles in May and June. They start to grow up through the summer. As they become adult, they reproduce. Then in the winter, all the adults die. So the adults and hatchlings who are alive in October, November, as soon as the weather gets, or their environment gets to 40 degrees, they don't survive. So they don't survive the winter. However, the cocoons do overwinter, and that's where part of the problem lies. So just to put it in perspective, there's a picture of a couple of the cocoons, and you can see how tiny the hatchling is on a hand. Those are the little ones. So how do you control them? Well, they need, as soon as the temperature goes below 40, they die, except for the cocoons. Temperatures above 105 will kill them, including the cocoons. So one of the things that helps is to heat them up. And the other is, a suggestion is tilling your soil when the hatchlings are born, to just chop them up. And it's kind of ironic, though, we've all been trying to do no-till and preserve the soil structure, and now to control the worms, we're told to till the soil, but the worms are going to destroy the soil structure anyhow. So if you had a field that was full of worms, or a large garden, that's what you would do. There are some other things. People are working on biological controls and chemical controls. There are some birds and lizards who will eat them. However, they do tend to assimilate heavy metals in their bodies. So you don't want, if you have heavy metals in your soil, you don't want your chickens to be eating these worms, for example. And there's been good results using tea seed meal, but that's still being researched. I can talk about that a bit later. So going back to the heat idea, one of the big suggestions is to solarize your soil. So if you're bringing in compost or bringing in bags of dirt, put bags out in the sun to heat up for a while. If you have a lot, you might try making a soil burrito, which is you put clear plastic out, pile your soil on it, fold it over like a burrito, and leave it in the sun to bake till it gets up to over 100. I can talk about that. It's harder to do than it sounds. If you're sharing plants and as a gardener, you want to rinse roots, but then you have to try and get cocoons out of the rinse water. Maybe a little chlorine. Drop the worms in soapy water or solarize them or freeze them. In your compost, you want to be sure your compost is well heated, but one of the problems with compost is it might be over 100 in the center of the compost, but if there are any worms, they will move to the edges of the compost where it's not so hot. And then when things cool off, they can move back. So mixing up compost and making sure that the edges get heated up would also be important. Really, the most recent advice is don't give them what they like. They like organic amendments, so don't mulch and compost so much. In my own garden, I would normally mulch and compost all the pathways, and this year I'm letting things dry out, be drier and hotter. They like moderate temperatures and moisture, so solarizing is good. And I've been solarizing compost because I have worms in them. And they like undisturbed soil, so digging it up and mixing the castings into the soil early in the season especially is discouraging for them. How to prevent spread. Obviously, don't share plants if you're infected. Whenever you bring something in to your land or your garden, check for evidence of worms, at least, big worms. Rinse soil if you're sharing, share bare-rooted plants. We've done that in our plant sale locally. Solarize, put things out in the sun. Again, sometimes easier said than done, but it's worth it. Get the temperature up over 100 and you're safe. We're always told, clean your boots and tools, brush tires of vehicles. Again, that's easily said. I don't know how often people clean their tractor treads, but be conscious of the possibility of tracking things from one place to another. One thing that's interesting is the ongoing research. So there are no approved or certified biopesticides yet, and there are companies that are working on certification. One of the difficulties is you're not allowed to use pesticides for anything other than what they're certified for. But the word is that there is that this tea seed meal is very effective, and they're doing research on a fungi on millet. I've been confused about what tea seed meal is, and it's actually from a tea related plant that is used for cooking oil, mainly in China. And the tea seed meal is what's left over after they press the tea for oil. It is not from the tea tree, which is the Melaleuca, which we use for other medicinal purposes. So apparently this tea seed meal fertilizer has been used with success in golf courses for a long time, just to keep worms down in general. So that has some positive, some possibilities. However, as Dr. Goris says, research is limited by low funding, and because there's only one life cycle per year, so they can set up experiments, but they can only go through one experiment a year. And there's some interesting, they're doing some interesting research at UVM, but it's limited. So there is a webinar from the Master Gardeners in the resources that talks about the more recent research. So we have this list of resources, which I can also send out as a separate document, which should be helpful. I'm sort of run through this pretty quickly, but I have a feeling we can have some good discussion now, but with some questions. So I'm going to stop the screen share, and I'm going to ask Lisa if we have some questions.
We do have a few questions. So let's see, there's some questions about the chickens. Someone says they feed these worms and other worms to their chickens. Are they spreading the egg cases into the chicken manure, and then they spread that in their garden? So, because they don't always compost their manure.
Well, I'm not an expert, but I think if they're eating the worm, then the worm is being digested. So that's the cocoons would be elsewhere. I would be careful though about this heavy metal business. So it's hard to say. The last I read on it is that if your soil has a lot of heavy metal in it, then you don't want your chickens eating these worms. But I'm not sure how much heavy metal we have in our soils around here.
So, and that sort of answers Leah's question, which was the next one about, she heard them feeding through their chickens, and others have said not to do it. So you have to make that choice. Think about what the soils have, and
yeah. One of the recommendations was get your soil tested. But on the other hand, I don't know. I would go into some of the resources and check on that, because I don't know how big an issue that is. It's one of those little factoids that's thrown out there, and then you don't know if it's a big deal or if it's minimal risk.
Great. The question, you said, tilling, we used to be no till, and now, the suggestion is to till. Should you till more than once? Cindy wants to know.
Well, that's a good question. So the point of the tilling is to cut up the young worms, the hatchlings, before they get large enough. If you do it too soon, you still have a lot of cocoons hatching afterwards. If you do it too late, maybe they're adults. Theoretically, doing it more than once would get the late bloomers, but then how much tilling can you do? I mean, you also have to plant. And I don't know. I also think it might depend on how big a garden you have, and I think it's just one of a number of tools. If you have something big enough to till, using a rototiller or a tractor, at least doing it once, you're doing something.
So just to clarify, are the eggs spreading on wood chip mulch? So it sounded like it was after Hurricane Irene or whichever one you suggested. So it sounds like that if they chipped the trees, the eggs were transported in the mulch. Is that correct?
It's a theory. Yeah. Well, they would have been in the soil, but with things getting if they got mixed up with some of the mulch at one spot, they might have been transported to another spot. For example, so with our flooding this month, I was doing a morning of volunteer work in Ludlow. And by chance, I was working outside. I was removing silt from outside a restaurant. And as I moved some silt, what do I see but a couple of long jumping worms? And my heart sank because, of course, those worms might have been there, but where they were at the edge of the parking lot, they probably had come in with the water, and probably there are plenty of cocoons that came along with that silt. So you get something like the flooding that's just moving those organisms around. So I'm guessing that the theory about the Hurricane Sandy, that's how they can't figure any other way that so many the worms would have spread so fast. So what else would have moved worms from one or two little parks to 2/3 of the parks in New York?
Mm. Martha notes that she's looking for the tea seed meal, but seeing it's not USDA approved for vegetable gardens, is it safe for the vegetable gardens?
I'm not sure, but yeah, I'm not sure. I was looking at some of the fertilizers last night, trying to figure it out. It's not clear to me. And Dr. Goris said the company that was supplying it has stopped while they go through a process. But I think it will be. I get the impression it will be okay for vegetables, for agriculture. Does anyone else know? Anyone else have a sense of that?
Go ahead and type it in the chat box and we'll find it there.
Yeah. I have the impression that it will be okay to use, and I've seen a few posts online of people who said they used it.
Yeah. All right.
I think, yeah, I'm not sure on that one.
So Leah wants to know, what's the best way to pick them up? She says she's getting over being squeamish, but she's guessing gloved hands or put them in a bucket. You mentioned soapy water. Is there a preferred way to get them?
Okay, I can only talk about my preferred way. I don't like picking up worms with my fingers. It's just a little too squirmy. So yeah, I have my garden gloves on, and I just pick them up and put them in the water. If you try and pick them up with a tool, they'll squirm out of it. Let's see. Let me show you a picture or two. So hang on.
That sounds great. Reminds me of picking out my tomato hornworms.
Oh yeah. Okay, sorry, I don't know how to make this full screen. So this is this is in the bottom of a bucket without water when I was just working someplace, and I picking them out and throwing them in there, and then I added some soapy water. There's just a normal garden glove. So this is here's the squiggly. So I found these near my compost bin. This is on top of the compost bin. I'm trying to take a photo of them. Watch them squiggle. Hang on a sec. Hang on. Here it comes. Right off the edge.
Yeah.
Now here's talking about how to get rid of them. So I tried solarizing them and in the back of a wheelbarrow, because I don't want to put it on the grass because it'll kill the grass. I don't have a driveway I can block up. So I had them in a hang on. I had them in in plastic, and I think they were hatching in the plastic. So finally I put the plastic, I bought some bins at Walmart. I put them in clear plastic bags in the bins, and I have a room in my house, a sort of solarium. So I put them out in these bins there with a thermometer, and where the heat got up to over 120 on hot days, and burned the buggers out.
And did it work?
Yeah, I think so. Oh, hang on. I have a picture of the dead ones there. Look at that. See all those are all dead worms. So now I've got a system where I let it compost partly in my composter, and then I solarize it. I have it in the bins so that there's no leakage. I don't want, leaky compost goo in my house. But that holds it in nicely, also keeps the smell in, and that seems to be working. So it means handling the compost more than once, but it's how I'm doing it these days. Let's see if I have another video for you.
So I'm going to read the next question. Talks about the solarizing process. So I'm wondering about the solarizing process with bags of topsoil or mulch. Have you found the process that gets the temp up quickly so you move it into your very hot room?
Yeah, so they, in some of these various webinars and conferences, they suggest clear plastic, not black plastic. That clear plastic will give you more of the greenhouse effect. I'll just give you another, see them squiggle, see that going? So I've bought some clear plastic big garbage bags, and I fill it with compost or soil, and sometimes in a 5-gallon bucket to keep it from spreading, and stick it out in the sun on a sunny day, a couple hours, all day on a sunny day, maybe 2 days. You can stick a thermometer in. It's the solarizing process. They suggest don't make it more than 6 or 8 inches thick, though, because you want it to get hot all the way through. What happens is any live worms in there are going to try and get to the edges. They're trying to get out. They're trying to get to the cool part. But you also want it to get hot all the way through for any cocoons. It's the cocoons that I have in my head. That's what you want to minimize the cocoon production as much as you can.
Do you know if UVM has any interest or any citizen science researching or at least documenting where they're seeing the worms or anything like that going on?
Well, yeah, they keep saying to let them know, let Dr. Goris know, but I think I don't get responses. I don't know if he's responding to people, but they do ask that you post it in something like iNaturalist. So if you ever use iNaturalist, posting it in iNaturalist keeps a record of it and goes into the general record, which the researchers do use. But if you watch one of the lectures, it'll give you some contact information for Dr. Goris at UVM.
Great. Someone noted that they heard that when a worm gets cut up, they can grow a whole new body. Is that the case with these jumping worms or any worms? Is that a myth or a fact?
Well, these worms, they can sometimes drop a tail. So it's not that they can reproduce, but they can lose a part of their tail and still survive, but only the front part does. The tail doesn't become another worm. So I've had that happen once or twice where it's kind of broke off, but it doesn't seem to be, it's not like you pick it up and it automatically, and chopping them up chops them up. They don't reproduce that way.
So good fish food.
Other worms.
What does it mean that they're more aggressive?
Well, when you saw them squiggling in the video there, they just seem to be more active. I'm not sure. I think the claymation, I think they're saying that they're actually aggressive towards other worms, but I don't know enough about them for that. They just seem more like they're more active. So
I'm not sure you'll be able to answer this particular question, but someone's wondering about Moodoo, using that and bringing that in. They said they now have worms in their raised beds. And I would say, check the kind of word. It could be European worms, but it could be these jumping worms. And so
I've heard of worms coming in some very reputable companies. So but my personal feeling is, and again, I'm no expert, my personal feeling at this point is any worm is a bad worm. I don't want worms in my garden. And if, maybe I could have gotten some, I know the earthworms might be good for it, but I've got other things good for it. So I'm not going to worry too much. If I have worms coming in, I'm getting rid of them. And it could come in on reputable brands and from reputable people. That's the hard thing to deal with. Anytime you bring soil in from anywhere is going to be iffy.
So we know they move with the soil when we move soil. Without that, how fast do they move without that added human element of moving things?
Well, that's a good question. There's in one of the articles here, the article in the Atlantic is a very readable article, for a big picture. There's some they can move sort of through an area, and one person said 30 feet in a year, which seems like a lot to me. But they can kind of, I'm trying to be very careful not to throw. Normally I used to throw things into the woods, any organic matter from the garden that I didn't like, I'd throw it into the woods across my driveway because, it'll decompose. It's all part of the big system. But I don't do that now because I don't want them getting started in the forest, and I don't want them, year by year, suddenly, slowly working their way in. So I don't know if it's a couple inches or a couple feet, but they can move their way through. I have seen very slow movement on the edge, certain places in my lawn where you can see they've edged over a little more, inches, barely. And I'm sure, the climate is, they're not going wild for me, but I know I've heard of people who have been infested. So every time I think I'll just not worry about it, I start thinking, well, and then what happens to me 5 years, 10 years down the line?
Right. Nita was worrying, do you need to worry about cocoons in the middle of summer, or would they all be hatched by then and then you're just looking for the worms from June on, like the life cycle picture?
Yeah, I think, I'm trying to remember, I think they might have a 2-year lifespan. The cocoons can last a while. They dehydrate and then sort of go into a hibernation. So they can hatch at any time, but they're being produced only by the adult worms. So any cocoons that are hatching during the summer are from the previous, from previous years. And it's, your focus should be on, can you get some of those immature worms before they reproduce? Now, and I'm sorry, I don't have the numbers right at my fingertips. I think they only produce 30 to 60 cocoons per worm. And, you have to think, not all of them survive, and you get some of them as hatchlings, and maybe birds get some. So yes, so the answer is yes, cocoons can be hatching at any time that the temperature and the moisture level is conducive. But you don't worry if they hatch in the middle of the summer. They're not going to be reproducing before they die in the fall. So what is it? I think it's a 90 days, 60 days, 90 days. 90 days to mature. So if something hatches in July, August, September, October, we're about at the point now any little ones are going to die in the winter before they reproduce. So we don't care about them so much. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Frank wants to know, and I think you covered this, but I just want to ask the question, are there any safe or effective biological controls? Okay,
so I'm not allowed to recommend anything. So if you're not a certified pesticide person, you are not allowed to recommend anything. And everyone doing these webinars is very careful not to recommend any biochemical controls. If you go to the end of the research update on research webinar in the resources, Goris talks about some of the research with certain chemicals and biocontrols, and gives some names and talks about the percentage efficacy of this one's 41% effective, this one's 64%, the combination of this, and there are a couple of brand names mentioned. So again, I would go to the end of the update on research and listen to what he's talking about with the fungus on the millet and something called cocoa wet and the tea seed meal and some combinations of things. And also talks about, soap will kill them, but it will also kill your plants. Or some people have gone to the extreme of burning their land, which can kill the things at the surface, but worms will then dig deeper to get away from the fire. However, if you burn the land, you also take away much of their food source. So, I'm not going to take a blowtorch to my garden.
Someone said their daughter-in-law creates a little bonfire instead of the soapy water and burns them. So, a little offering that way, but it's another option.
One way or another, it's ashes to ashes, right?
Is there a map of the US of where these worms have now been documented that you know of?
Yes. In, in some of these resources, there are maps. And you can also look on iNaturalist. I can't put my fingers, it would take me a few minutes to find one. In general, these worms have really exploded around the Northeast in the last decade or two. And sadly, they're making their way into Canada. They hadn't been found in Canada till very recently. Again, it's kind of inching up along the East Coast. There's a different set of invasive worms in the West. And then in the South, the South has native earthworms, below the glaciation line, there are native North American earthworms. One of the interesting things about them is they are native to Japan and Korea, and they are not a pest there. So, in their own ecosystem, they're just, one of the worms.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, we seem to move everything. You talk about EAB, EAB may only travel maybe a half a mile to a mile a year, but they also travel 55 miles per hour in our cars. So we move things, and we certainly affect the environment there. Leah noted, should we clear the leaf litter then? You talked about burning it off, but I mean, as a forest person, certainly not in your forest, because that's so important for so many things in your forest, which is why they impact our forest so badly.
This is the problem is, so I want to keep my garden mulched and moist, and yet I don't want to encourage the worms. The leaf litter is it's such an interesting problem. I have one of my compost bins is on the edge of the woods, and there's a flat place where we dump leaves and grass clippings at the end of the year, and I have found the worms underneath them. So, I've raked it up. I'm doing the solarization thing, but I'm not going to go into the woods and try and rake up leaves in there. I mean, I think that opens you to other issues, and the seedlings and fungi and what all, they need that leaf litter. So that's a leaf litter, so not clear it, not in the forest, but you might clear it out of your garden. I think that's clear it out and then put it back.
So it's funny that you talk about the forest and that the worms are out there, and they could be European or they could be these jumping worms, because someone noted, I found about 8 or 9 worms under a plastic mat on a slate patio step just before this webinar. This was nowhere near the garden, but it is along the edge of some managed woody area. So they aren't only coming in with mulch or compost in tilled land. And again, it could be the European worm, so it might not be the Asian jumping worm, but the worms have, what'd you say, 1800 they came into
China,
at least the European
California
worms, and then so yeah, we're gonna see them. It's just really what impact can we have?
Well, and there I would say, given what I've learned about worms, being non-native, if I found a clump of worms, I would drown them in soapy water. I'm not going to worry about whether they're European or Asian. I don't need them for the health of my local ecosystem. It would be interesting, it would be interesting to know if they were. And I see that's, I think that's one of my neighbors. Yes, so I'm going to go look at her worms later. Nora, I'm coming for you.
I love it. I love it. I will note also, Juanita's slide with all of the resources, we will email that out with a recording of the webinar that you can share with others, and you can use the resource list for yourself. I didn't want to take the time to put that up right now, but we will send it out to you again. And if you watch the recording, you can always hit stop and stop it on that slide. So I think a final question, I think it's a great question to end with, Juanita, is do you hope that you will completely eliminate them someday, or is this just a lifelong battle?
I'm trying to resign myself to the lifelong part. It's perhaps a little bit like the Japanese beetles, that you kind of resign yourself that you're going to have to go out and pick off Japanese beetles. But it disturbs me more because it's so hidden and can be insidious. On the other hand, although I have them in various places around my house, they're not everywhere. So I assume there are places where I put the original manure that had them in it. So I know certain beds have the worms, and every time I work in a bed and it doesn't have the worms, I go, this one is okay. So they haven't like taken over, like, the killer jumping worms taking over the world. So there is hope. And although I found big bunches of them in certain areas, like in slimy, moist, leafy places, other places it's more like here's one, here's one, here's one. So they're not just out of control. So fingers crossed our climate stays cool, and psychologically it just becomes part of going out to the garden, is picking out worms. So my email is here. It's birchclay@gmail.com. If you think of some other questions, I would be happy to do my best. Again, I'm not an expert, but I keep reading up on it and doing the webinars because I don't want to be hit by surprise 10 years down the line.
We have a lot of invasive plants and insects and arthropods and things to be concerned about, but I think awareness is so important on all of these, and just picking one or two that you want to battle, that you're willing to take on and think about and share with others, so that this becomes a battle amongst all of us. And again, thinking about what Ptolemy says about planting for your native species, for your gardens, if you have pollinator gardens, using native species. These are great. Our pollinators are tied to when they flower and what they are. So really enhancing native species and taking care of those invasive species is, we all can have a little bit of an impact by doing that. A lot of thank yous in the chat box. I want to thank you.
Glad to share.
Our group is a peer-to-peer network, so this is the true sample of how things are shared peer-to-peer and learning together. And we really appreciate everyone taking the time to be on tonight. If you'd like to sign up for our e-news to learn about other programs that are available both in person and online, you may do so on our website. And there's also a donate button if you enjoyed this and want to support the organization so we can continue to do these kinds of programs. That would be great as well. Wish everyone a wonderful afternoon, and thank you for joining us. And we will be sending out an email with the resources.
Great. Thank you all. Thanks for coming.